Alright guys, let's talk about Bleak Faith Forsaken, an ambitious game that I've had a hell of a good time with, and struggled to put it down during my first playthrough. This review has been written at a time when I have completed the game, defeated all bosses, and have embarked on a second playthrough, all clocking in at around 30 hours. So I do believe I have enough experience with the game to give you a thorough idea of what it's about, its good points and its bad points. I am very familiar with the history of this game. I've been in contact with the devs since 2019, so the time when the Kickstarter actually launched, and I even had the opportunity to play a super early build from when the game was just a concept, and I covered this on my main channel, and I will link those videos down below if you want to see some early footage. With that said, I also need to let my biases be known. I am very invested in the success of this game, having been a backer on Kickstarter since 2019, and having various discussions with the devs regarding their vision. I think they are a great team with great ideas, so I may well have looked past some technical issues that others may not have been able to, just because I am invested in the world that this team are trying to create. When I first played the game on launch day, it was clear to see that their vision and artistic style has evolved from when I first played the game, and that was amazing to see. The art direction is fantastic. And yes, there was some roughness to the gameplay in the opening couple of days, but the devs have been so fast and so aggressive at doing hotfixes that it's honestly really impressive how much the game is already more polished than it was just over a week ago. But in all honesty, to me personally, I didn't really mind as much because I was so blown away by the art direction and feel of this game. There is an ambition to this game that is incredible to see. This is a game of exploration and finding yourself in an unreal, surreal world, finding secrets around every corner and something different to blow you away. But yes, there were bugs on launch that will have definitely turned some people off. But honestly, the game has improved so much that I've had to change this script so many times to remove different things that I had noticed as issues on my first playthrough, so that really speaks volume about the dedication of this dev team and how committed they are to making this an incredible game. And in general, I think there would have been a more positive reception if this game had been marked as early access or a beta build. This project is created by a 3-person team, an absolutely astonishing achievement, and they've had a really rough few days with the press surrounding this. So please, even if you do have issues with the game, let's keep it civil and constructive. And that is how I've tried to be when approaching this game. When it comes to scoring or recommending this game, I won't be doing either. Instead, I will just be talking about my rather positive experience with this game. I personally loved the unique feel of this game and exploring the Omni structure. Instead, I will talk about my personal experience, what I saw as good and bad, and let you come to your own conclusions. That being said, one final thing I'll say before we get into the review proper is the game is in a far better state than you may have heard of in the first week or so. There were certainly some technical and core issues there, but the team have been really aggressively patching these things out, and so I can say that my second playthrough has certainly been far smoother than my first playthrough. So with that said, let us get into the review, and remember to subscribe to the channel and like this video. Let us talk briefly about performance and graphics. In my time with the game, I found the performance to be excellent, remaining very stable throughout, with there only being a few instances of frame drops, and that was mainly when you transition between areas. And this is me running the game at the high graphics setting with 60 FPS, and I have a very mid-range PC, having a Nvidia RTX 2060 and an AMD Ryzen 5 3600. When it comes to the graphics, the game is made in Unreal Engine 4, so the fidelity may not blow you away, but I find it very serviceable, and it is certainly carried by the incredible art direction. You will be blown away by the vistas in this game, whether you find the core mechanics frustrating or not. The game begins as many Souls games do, with an obscure, confusing introduction cinematic that gives you some brief flavour of the world that you're in, and then bam, you find yourself in the tutorial area known as the monastery. So let's talk briefly about the story and setting, but I will try and cover that more fully in a following video. The world around us is known as the Omni structure, a world-spanning megacity of different layers. This city is so large that different cultures with different levels of technological advancement are spread throughout it. This is why in some areas you will find walkers with laser beams, and in some areas you will instead find knights with full plate armour. This universe is ruled over by a god emperor, and much like the Warhammer 40,000 universe, this results in a society that has an oppressive and unforgiving religion at its core, that venerates their ruler as divine.
I empathize with those we purify. But when I lay my hands on the Seldars, hell will seem like heaven.
This particular Imperial colony is under threat by an object called the Anomaly, whose corruption is spreading throughout the Omnistructure, corrupting people and Crusaders alike. A crusade has been sent against this Imperial colony to deal with a rebel known as Yaroslav, who essentially is defending the entrance to the Anomaly. The Anomaly is not only causing a plague, but later on causes some dimensional and timeline shenanigans, making it clear that this is an object beyond the ken of humanity, and also lends itself to the multiple dimension bending locations that we sometimes find ourselves in. You are one of the Forsaken, bizarre cyborg-like beings who can never truly die, who have long been enslaved by the administration. In fact, one of my favourite features in the game is that your death is explained as you not ever truly dying, and when you die, your old body is left behind and you are reconstituted in a new form, meaning you can see your corpses throughout the game. This is introduced to us in the opening cinematic, when your character walks past the dying previous vessel, and this can lead to some hilarious moments when you're facing against a boss you've died against several times, and you see your corpse, times 20, strewn across the arena. You have a role in this crusade. Your handler and the Royal Brigade captain direct you to deal with the Anomaly and help stabilise this region.
I do not merely rely on you, I trust in you. Don't let me down.
With all that said, the starting area very much reflects the lore of this story. You start in a monastery to the God Emperor, whose visage is all around us. And so let's talk about the monastery introduction to the game. This area acts as a tutorial level to the game, similar to the Undead Asylum in Dark Souls, for example. You start naked with a wrench, and there's a boss blocking your way to the main hub. It is all very familiar for those of the Souls genre, but the monastery really shines in its interconnected design. It loops round, there are different levels, new shortcuts and secrets to be found in a fairly vast level for an introduction. Stuck against Conrad the Deserter, the first boss? No problem. Why don't you farm the knights below for their full armour set and grab the Technomancer staff? This is a massive area with shortcuts, weaving paths and elevators that all connect. That being said, you can just beat Conrad with a pipe and move on to the hub world. But at the very beginning of the game you are introduced to one of Bleak Faith's main strengths, its level design, exploration and art design. The world is very much interconnected and clearly takes inspiration from the first Dark Souls. Beyond this self-contained introductory zone, once you beat the boss, you come to the block, your Firelink shrine for all intents and purposes. You are given a vague mission and then bam, you are left to your own devices to follow one of the many paths to the other zones and other bosses. The world is utterly sprawling, with many different varied zones that you initially wouldn't expect from a game that is anchored in a very urban setting. One area is a submerged city that is turned into an ocean known as the Deluge. And to proceed, you are forced to dive into truly frightening depths with a sunken city all around you. Not only that, but you are plagued by ginormous snake-like creatures who, if you don't time your crossing carefully, will absolutely attack you and kill you. This is one of the greatest moments in the game when it comes to the art direction. All around you, you see this fallen city, right in the depths of a huge ocean, with these monsters all around you. It's just a great moment, and terrifying even for those without thalassophobia. Later on, you can also find a massive stretching desert, plagued by sandstorms, where you are stalked by a massive worm creature. In each area, a lot of attention is given to the vistas, views and feel of the area, and in this sense, Bleak Faith is among the best I've seen, with giant worms flying around cloud-tipped towers, to the oppressive innards of the Omnistructure, or to the silent hell feel of Ghost Town. There's such variety, and it all just adds to the bizarre feeling that the Omnistructure gives you. This was the feel and art direction that attracted me years ago when I first played the pre-build. It's good to see that it is consistent with what they imagined years ago in that early build, but to see them expand upon it in this way is truly a feast for the eyes. Exploration is checkmarked by the homunculi, the game's bonfire, and is further aided by one of the game's best features, the homunculi mirage. In essence, this was the planned feature from Dark Souls 3 that was cut late on, the ability to place your own bonfire out in the world. This actually becomes critical in some areas of Bleak Faith, as the space between checkpoints can be far and few between, with some difficult platforming and combat encounters ahead. And I just love the trust the devs give you in deciding for yourself where you need a checkpoint. That being said, this does help the lack of handholding at some points that were a little extreme for me. For example, in the water area, which I do love now, there are no indications or tutorials, at the time that I played anyway, that you can even dive under the water, nor is it told you that the red lights underwater can refill your O2, and in general it can really make it hard for you to understand how you are to forge your path ahead. That being said, I can't deny I had a great time in this first week, mapping the world and exchanging secrets with other players on the Discord. There were 0 guides at this time, so we just started playing, and then exchanging our own secrets and experiences, and that is so rare for a game these days, and it was special. Honestly, it felt like the good old Dark Souls 1 days, and Bleak Faith does have a seriously good community building around it. Overall, the exploration is one of the game's strongest aspects, with stunning vistas and worthwhile pickups like upgrade materials or unique gear that makes exploration really worth it. I'd say it's only really held back by the movement, which is, as you've probably heard, a little bit janky, and the jumps can feel a little floaty and frustrating. But at the end of the day, what is a Souls-like game without some frustrating platforming? I just want to make a quick note about the music. I am by no means a musical expert, but I always recognise a good ambient soundtrack. And again, I think Bleak Faith has great exploration and background music. It has a unique, melancholic feel that reminds me of the soundtrack for Pathologic 2, which has a similar weird lore and world to it, so I think the music's very fitting for when you're exploring this bizarre world around you. None of the boss music blew me away, but I do really rate the background music that makes exploring these unusual environments a joy and, in some places, very relaxing. The developers once told me that it was their ambition to have emergent gameplay, to have the world change with you as the game progressed, and in a way they have tried to achieve this through the Vermilion Knights. These are unique enemies that appear in areas you have already explored after you progress the game to a certain point, and another smaller way in which the game changes is the hub area later becomes home to some of the most powerful enemies, the Titan Slayers, who drop some of the best gear. Again, this is just a nice way of changing the world around you and giving you another reason to farm this area long after you had covered it before. This makes once simple areas extremely challenging, as the Vermilion Knights in particular are amongst the game's hardest hitting enemies, but they are guaranteed to drop some of the best materials, and so late game you will probably find yourself farming these guys as I did. I think the Vermilion Knights are one of the best ideas in Bleak Faith, and initially they were far too powerful, but again, at the time of writing this, the devs have already patched and nerfed these enemies following community feedback, showing how proactive the devs are in fixing and balancing this game. And now these Vermilion Knights are far less frustrating and just a great addition to add a little bit of extra challenge. In general, all the enemies are pretty interesting from an art design perspective, my personal favourite being these hideous giant spider enemies with a screaming face. There are also big ape enemies whose face split open. In the upper reaches of the city there are samurai-esque warriors, there are knights, mutants, and even enemies in old diving gear. All of these vastly different enemies reinforce the bizarre nature of the Omni structure, that each section is so spread out that vastly different species and societies have risen and fallen. The bosses also vary dramatically and mechanically. My favourite from both a design and mechanics point of view is the Plague Nemesis, which behaves very much like a traditional Souls boss with a cool design to boot. Then at the other end of the spectrum there is the Worm God, a disgusting and beautiful monster that really takes the scale of the game to a new level. You can even climb this beast in your attempts to fight it. With that said, I did find some of the bosses frustrating on my first playthrough, but again, the devs have already balanced the game and some of the bosses accordingly, so I imagine that this will be a better experience going forward. With that said, let us talk about the gear and leveling, as this is one of the game's more unique aspects. So there are no starting classes, and there are no souls or experience points used to level up. This does make death certainly less punishing, however it is a bit of a rewire for us who have played From Software games for years, and I didn't really pay attention to my build till the last third of the game when the difficulty meant I had to. The first thing to understand is that your ability to craft and upgrade your weapons is tied to your handler, your bonfire and blacksmith all in one. The handler's synchronization level can be upgraded 5 times, with each level increasing the maximum level you can upgrade your weapons to, as well as eventually unlocking additional things for you to craft. For example, at a level 3 synchronization, you can upgrade your weapons to a maximum of Mark III. If you want to get to the maximum weapon level of Mark V, you will need to upgrade your synchronization level for your handler appropriately. And your handler can be upgraded by finding items in the world called handler echoes, and once you return to your handler at the central hub, they will upgrade. So not only does upgrading your weapons and armour increase their stats, but it also unlocks more slots that you can embed into every weapon and every armour piece, and there is a maximum of 5 gem slots, 1 for each level upgraded, and these gems are the singular most important items when it comes to your build, as gems are typically what you use to add and change your attributes and modify your damage. Each gem has 2 stats. If you put it into armour, it'll modify your attributes, so your strength, your intelligence, and your constitution. They are directly modified by the gems that you are placing into your armour. And if you put it into your weapon, it'll modify your damage in some way, i.e. by adding crit chance, crit damage, etc. There are also accessory items that add additional bonuses on top of this, like rings and amulets that can again modify your damage or add to your attributes. This of course means that you can adapt and customize your build as you wish. For example, I went from a balanced build early on to one that heavily stacked strength later on. These gems are obtainable via drops in the world, and they can be crafted specifically via the handler. Manufacturing is an option via your handler, where you can craft more weapon upgrade shards and these gems, with the higher level recipes unlocking as you upgrade your handler and progress the game. Also, another great feature is that the gems you find in the world can have their essence extracted, and essence is the material to craft new gems. So if you have a stack of gems you don't like, simply break them down and use their essence to craft new gems you do want. Aside from managing your stats in this way, your build can also be augmented through perks and abilities, purchasable at any time with the relevant items. Perk items being dropped via bosses, and ability shards being found throughout the world. Perks are of course passive bonuses that you can use to augment and supplement your build, and abilities are activated moves that come in a great variety. For example, I purchased a perk that makes me almost invincible when using a full set of heavy armour. And in terms of abilities, there are many, my favourites being a 100% shield that allows me to tank a full hit with no damage, much like the shield sign from The Witcher. There's also a fire burst that does some damage over time to all enemies in front of you in a cone, and debuffs them. And there's finally a move which I think is really cool, where you dash backwards and leave some caltrops on the ground to damage your enemies that advance upon you. All good stuff. This does bring me to an observation about the game and the numbers associated with it, and the amount of builds you can do. I would say that Dark Souls 2 is the closest to a traditional RPG in terms of your stats and builds, where your stats can directly affect the way that your character plays in the game, whereas in other Dark Souls games you could 100% rely upon your skill. I would say that Bleak Faith is kind of closer to Dark Souls 2 in this regard, where your build can have a massive impact upon the way that you play and the numbers that your character can produce. For example, there are critical hits in this game, a thing that's not present in Souls games. And I was struggling with a particular boss near the end, so I stacked my build as high strength as possible, as high as critical damage and critical chance as possible, meaning I carved through them in about 5 to 6 lucky hits. There are other unique builds, one that rely on flux, essentially mana, so you can spam abilities and weapon abilities and technomancy, and there are others that rely on status effects, something that I am truly to experiment with. So with that said, let us talk about the combat. It has all the bells and whistles that you'd expect from a Souls-esque game. Stamina management, parrying, blocking, and a whole bunch of weapons that have different movesets, damages, and benefits. However, there are some differences here, and the main one that most people struggle to get used to, myself included, is that there are no iframes when you roll and dodge. They are literally just for your spacing. And I'll be honest, I found this frustrating at times. And this isn't necessarily the game's fault, you just have to get used to something that sets it quite far apart from other Souls games. It's not what you'd expect. And again, in my second playthrough, I am far more comfortable with this now. But yeah, I certainly experienced some frustration in my first playthrough when fighting certain bosses, and I rolled under their attacks only to still get hit by it because I'm not invincible at that point. On my first playthrough as well, I noticed there were some issues with hitboxes in the first playthrough, where you think you definitely hit something, you feel like you swung through them, and it did no damage, and likewise you could be standing right in front of an enemy and they didn't clip you. And these are some of the core elements that the devs are certainly working on now, and again on my second playthrough, I'm not sure if it's a combination of patches and my experience, but again I'm having less issues with this on my second playthrough, and I feel quite satisfied with the combat now. When you do hit with a big weapon, it feels crunchy and satisfying. There's a dismemberment system. When you hit something really hard with a heavy weapon, their legs, arms and heads can fly off, and it just adds an extra little bit of weight to the combat and gives a satisfying combat loop. When it comes to non-melee weapons, I quite extensively use the bow and arrow as my secondary weapon, and the range combat is actually really well done. It feels snappy and responsive, and you hit where you aim. They also don't just hit like wet noodles, they actually hit really hard, and I find myself actually dealing with some of the more powerful enemies more effectively with arrows, some headshots getting massive numbers, and it is very satisfying. But because it is so powerful, there is a limiting factor to it. You get a limited amount of arrows to use per encounter, i.e. when an enemy is aggroed upon you, so you get 8 regular arrows, 8 piercing arrows, and up to 3 shock arrows, I believe. And once you've used those and they're still aggro, you can't use your bow anymore essentially. But I think that this is a good choice, because if I had unlimited arrows in every fight, I'd be using it for every fight. I'd be using it on every boss fight. It is that powerful. Likewise, I have found magic or technomancy to be very easy to use, and again, very powerful. It doesn't hit like a wet noodle. Basically, equip a staff, aim and shoot. It's that simple. Very responsive and some good damage, especially on certain enemies who take more damage from technomancy. And it makes the mana usage worth it, and you can build around your mana or flux usage. Aside from the usual aspects of combat, there's also a climb mechanic for some of the giant enemies, and it basically plays out like this. You weaken the enemy's legs that have health bars, and then when they are depleted, the enemy will kneel down, and then you can interact to mount their back and attack certain set points on their back until they go down. Now there are some issues here. The giants used to basically insta-kill you when they swiped at you, and the devs have since patched this so that their hits take armor into account, which they didn't before. They just did a set huge amount of damage. So I would say it's in an acceptable state now. Again, I've engaged more with this mechanic on my second playthrough, and I found it a little bit better. I'm not sure mechanically it's my favourite system, but I can't deny it looks cool and cinematic, and to be honest, it's fairly rare that you have to engage with it. You don't even need to engage with giants anyway, except for one boss who is actually more polished in this regard, than the regular giants, and again, I'm finding less issues with it now, no doubt as a result of experience and patches by the devs. With all that said, the Discord is alive with positive feedback and discourse, with the devs very open and responsive to each bug or balance issue that players find, so I'm sure that any niggles will be tidied up in time. For now, the combat is good fun, with some inconsistent difficulty spikes and a little bit of floatiness, but I hope that this will be ironed out in time. It can be frustrating the first time you try to learn how the roll system works, but again in time you get used to the idea that spacing is more important in this game. So I want to talk about items and gear now. So I mentioned the manufacturing process where you needed to speak to your handler to craft certain key items like your gems and your upgrade shards for your weapons. However, there is a more basic crafting system that is accessible at any time out in the world. And again, this is part of the game that I really like. Basic enemies all drop potions, gems and crafting materials, with the crafting materials being used to craft more potions. The game is like Bloodborne in that you rely on finite healing potions, so it's good that you can craft more with the plentiful crafting materials that you'll get from almost any enemy, and it certainly helps mitigate the annoyance I had in Bloodborne with the finite healing materials. Aside from healing and mana potions, there are some pretty interesting buff potions that you can experiment with new recipes being unlocked as you progress the game. Finally, for the archers among us, you can actually craft your own arrows, the regular metal ones, armor piercing and shock arrows that stun enemies. What I really like about crafting arrows is that you can pick up the broken arrow item from the corpse of enemies that you have killed with arrows, and these broken arrows are items that can be used to craft new arrows. But aside from craftables and potions, the main star of Forsaken's pickups is the gear itself, farmable from certain enemies or just found as pickups around the world for the more intrepid explorers among us. And for me, this is one of the best parts of the game for me, because I absolutely love the look of the weapons and armour in this game, and I genuinely found myself excited when I got to try on a cool new helmet or armour set, or the Iron Helm that has a horsehair crest and it generally looks like the Faram helmet from Dark Souls 2, as well as another pretty out there helmets, cloaks and weapons. All great stuff and some real good things for fashion, which is ultimately the end game of playing any of these games in the first place. Now let's get to the bugs and kind of rough edges of Bleak Faith, because again I want to re-emphasise that the devs are committed to stabilising all of these bugs, but they have obviously admitted there are a lot of rough edges, and you can see that no doubt in the gameplays that you have seen on YouTube. Cinematics can bug out with them either being no sound or kind of bizarre camera angles. There are some UI related bugs in regards to potion counts not being updated as you use them, and armour not being allowed to be equipped from the menu. There are some instances where you can get stuck out of bounds or in an area that you can't get out of, but thankfully there are respawn options in the menu to force a death and return you to the last checkpoint. The main bugs I personally noticed were the camera angle ones in the cinematics that were a little bit immersion breaking, but also the AI of the NPCs. Sometimes enemies would spawn in a wall or out of a floor, and sometimes they just get weird movement when they're tracking you and get stuck on a collidable object. But in general, I didn't run into any game-breaking bugs, rather I would just describe the game as having some rough edges in general, feeling like it did when I played Baldur's Gate 3 Early Access when it first came out, which also had some bizarre things happening in the cinematics or whatever. But I wouldn't point to any one specific bug that gave me an issue, rather the game just feels a little rough, although like I've said, it feels a lot less rough already with the fast work of the devs. In general, I am someone who cares more about the art direction and atmosphere of a game, and this game is oozing with atmosphere. I'm not overly bothered by bugs, especially with being aware of the state the game's in, so your potential enjoyment of the game is dependent with what you care more about. I know some people really do not like playing beta level games or games with rough edges, and I completely empathise with that. It's just that for me personally, I care more about the vision and feel of a game, and I like this one in Bleak Faith Forsaken. So with a very basic review done, let us talk about some of the controversies, I'm hesitant to use that term, but surrounding this game and its publicity. The first is the review bombing and the general negativity that surrounded the first 2 or so days of the game's release, which are now stabilising on things like Steam, for example. Now, I'm someone who believes I'm very measured in my responses to things, so I would never be as harsh as other people would be, and for that reason I'm not a great reviewer, I'm not particularly critical. But I don't think it's fair some of the level of attacks that this game has been presented with. I think people have been making legitimate criticisms, constructive feedback, but there have also been people unfairly dumping on the game, and I don't agree with that. However, I do think the developers did make a mistake in not marking this game as early access. A lot of the bad will would have been mitigated had they marked it as early access or beta build. And so I do think it's fair that people maybe went into this expecting a more polished experience based on the trailers and the fact it was a release date rather than a beta release, and that's totally fair. As someone familiar with the game and its development, I went in with tempered expectations, but not everyone had that close contact with the game. But I've had a lot of fun playing the game with that expectation, and I've been sharing any bugs and feedbacks with the developers, and in general been talking to people about these issues in the Discord, and it's been a lot of fun. I do think if people were made aware of the state of the game, people would not be judging it so harshly. And that's kind of my thoughts on the review bombing. A little bit of fault on both sides. Secondly, there was an accusation made on Twitter that the game used ripped animations from Elden Ring and Dark Souls 3. This is an accusation that the Bleak Faith team have now addressed, and in my opinion they've handled it extremely professionally. The team have stated they purchase a lot of the game's assets via the Epic Store, including these animations. And when this was brought to their attention, they escalated the matter with Epic immediately, and being unsatisfied with the Epic's answer, which basically was, we can't validate whether this is ripped or not, they are replacing these animations in the coming days, and in fact, at the time of recording this, I believe they have already replaced these animations. So quick work from the devs, good of them to get that sorted immediately. And in regards to whether they knew this was the case or not, I'm happy to take them at their word, as far as I understand it from the conversations in the Discord, the devs didn't actually play Dark Souls 3 or Elden Ring. The team also used AI art for some of the perk icons. I'm very much against AI art, pretty publicly on Twitter as well, and I was not aware of this at all. I didn't pay attention to the perk art, to be honest with you. And I would have raised this with the developers, but the time it was raised to myself, they had already been so fast and replaced these. And again, I think that's the best we can hope for in this situation. There was a criticism and they've addressed and replaced it. So again, kudos to the developers for sorting that. The Bleak Faith Discord in general is such a great hub of feedback and bug reporting. I haven't seen the like before, to be honest with you. The devs are engaging in open, honest dialogue about what they're feeling about all this feedback and what they're fixing. This game is interesting to people for the way it's assembled and for the originality it brings to the genre of RPGs. This is primarily an exploration RPG, and I hope people now understand that. It has elements from lots of different RPGs, but it brings a level of exploration that's incredibly ambitious for our team size. And I truly find it's our strongest selling point. Players are encouraged to be curious, to explore, to experiment with perks and builds, and to find cool gear while never knowing what the next area will bring. That's the appeal. We just messed up the execution of some core features, but that will get ironed out. And this is the core of Bleak Faith as I see it now. It is an ambitious game. Maybe too ambitious for 3 people? Perhaps. But they have been committed to this incredible vision since day one, and I saw that back in 2019. I had a blast exploring the world they've built, and despite their frustrations, I couldn't put the game down until I finished. From the depths of the Omni structure to the depths of the ocean. Like they say, some of the core mechanics are not sorted because of the ambition that this game provided. I have no doubt that in the days, weeks and months, this will be ironed out in time, and we will have a unique and beautiful experience. Yes, the game essentially is in early access, and that should have been stated as such. And ultimately, I will not be recommending this for you or against it. All I will tell you is my experience, that I had a great time with this game, and I think there is something very special here, and I look forward to the future. So thanks guys, that is my take on Bleak Faith Forsaken, the mechanics of the game, as well as some of the issues surrounding it. If you like this video, please give it a like and consider subscribing to the channel, as I'll probably be covering Bleak Faith a little bit in the future. Let me know your thoughts down below, but again, please keep it constructive. And until next time folks, I will see you in the depths of the Omni structure. Take care and have a wonderful evening.